I'm talking here with Hedwig Fijen, director of the Manifesta. Hello, Hedwig.
Hello, good morning.
Hedwig, you founded Manifesta in 1993. The first edition took place in Rotterdam. What was your basic idea for this event, and what did change through all the years of its existence? How did you respond to a changing political, social, and cultural world?
So thank you for Jürgen to ask these questions in this interview. Manifesta was an idea of 8 European countries who came together directly after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And in the 3 years following this opening up of the former Iron Curtain, people were speaking a lot about creating a dialogue between West and Eastern Europe, because especially also in the cultural world, there was not a kind of a dialogue, there were no exchanges. And the idea of bringing artists and curators together on a new innovative platform, which could also move from one place to another, was the idea of Manifesta. Why mobility? Mobility because of this idea that since the Erasmus funding of the European Union, the idea of young artists who could be born in Bologna, study in London and have a studio in Berlin. But secondary, that it would be interesting for an international event to give young artists and curators a chance at the beginning of their career, while Venice and Document at that time were only as a kind of a celebration at the end of your career. Then secondary, it was not national orientated, but European orientated. And the idea of nomadic comes from, of course, the idea of including and making known what was very much not so much on everybody's awareness, that people from Vienna didn't dare to go in the beginning of the 90s to Bratislava, although the city was 30 kilometers away. So it was like getting a deep inside view on how we could live together, work together, how we could exchange information. And now we are 25 years later. Of course, balancing the gap between East and West has maybe in some way really happened. We see it in some countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but on the other side, I think there was also 25 years later a disillusion about what really how some of the countries in former communist pact were really integrated. I think the European Union, of course, did its share, but I'm now working in Pristina in Kosovo, and you see that the Western Balkan is still left out, and the effects this has on an economical scale, but also on all kind of other levels. And I think what Manifesta tried to do is the first, let's say, 5 editions focusing very much on working together with the Soros Centers for Contemporary Art in the Central and Eastern European countries to put people on the artist in a larger international context to make sure that always curators from East and West are working together. Later, we developed Manifesta far more in an interdisciplinary format, working with architecture, urbanism, but also music, opera, etc. We're working site-specific. This means that Manifesta was one of the biennales who produced 35 to 50 new works, especially for artists from Central and Eastern Europe. This was in the beginning very much a new way of working. Third, we were working a lot in experimental curatorial formats. I think Manifesta introduced a collective curating format in the beginning of the 90s and international teams working together. And I think in the last 5 editions, we worked very much on a kind of bottom-up way. So not only starting with curators who will tell everybody what we need to do, but far more creating inclusive teams. This means like people from many different backgrounds working together. I remember Manifesta 12, where we worked with architects, urbanists, feminist filmmakers, also like people from the visual arts, but a combination of different disciplines. And this had, of course, immediate effect and impact on how the Biennale what the Biennale is presenting. The final main thing what changed in the 25 years is, and especially through COVID, is that Manifesta is very much looking forward to have a real legacy. We're calculating legacies and impact since Manifesta 9 in Genk. We're inviting universities to do, let's say, an update, an intervention in terms of qualitative and quantitative surveys. And we are looking very much into evaluating our own practices, and we publish this. And this means that cities understand what role Manifesta can play as a catalyst or an incubator, but also cities are giving us commissions. And many people might say, oh, then you're not autonomous anymore. Yes, we are, but we think for really making changes in cities, for really making a difference, you need to collaborate with public administrations. Otherwise, you're left aside in a museum or in a white cube space. And especially this kind of collaboration with public bodies had also caused the effect that we were really able to leave a kind of an impact, both in refurbishing spaces, in changing maybe certain cultural policies, even in cities. I would say even a certain approach to what culture can mean for policymakers in the city, but also, let's say, in putting cities on the map. 21% of the visitors to Palermo came to Palermo because of the cultural infrastructure after Manifesta. So this kind of investigation of what kind of legacy Manifesta can have, and how we work with public administrations in what we call engaged autonomy is a key topic in our work. So in 25 years, we've changed regularly our methodology, our experimental way of working, our shying away from curators to creative mediators, the engaged autonomy, the interdisciplinary and the participatory way of working. And I think now the challenge is the next 25 years.
So, Hedwig, you said in this last 25 years, you've been on a front row, let's say, of innovating, let's say, an artistic system in which we live. So there probably are ups and downs. So what would you call your most important success in these 25 years, and what did not work out?
I think the best shift until now was after Manifesta 5, turning away from this kind of a biennial as a cultural marketing instrument, because Manifesta 6, even if it flunked in Cyprus, the title was How to Turn a Biennial into an Art School. So this was the shift from representation of contemporary art into learning and knowledge production, which I think was very key. The second most important part in shifting the, let's say, experimental methodology of Manifesta was very much focused on working together with public administrations and starting to think about how to turn a biennial into a platform for social urban change. And this like transformational process, turning from signals into substance, we call it, not only signaling how the world could look like and how we can live and work together, but also like maybe implementing some symbolic interventions. And that's the moment I started with inviting architects and urbanists was already in Manifesta 11 in Zurich, where we worked together with the ETH, Professor Tom Emerson, and created this floating pavilion, this green pavilion on the Lake Zurich. But in Manifesta 12, even if in Manifesta 11, architects were already, let's say, part of the curatorial team, it was not announced as such, But in Manifesta 12, 13, 14, and now, of course, also Manifesta 15 and 16, we're very much mobilizing interdisciplinary teams, as we call it, or transdisciplinary, meaning that the pre-biennial research is done by architects and urbanists. Why do we do this? Every other biennial has a fixed topos, a space. Berlin Biennial is always in Berlin, Documenta is always in Kassel, Venice is always in Venice. Manifesta is the only nomadic biennial. So every 2 years we need to reinvent not only our methodology, but mapping where we are. So mapping means not only in an urbanistic way, but also in a sociological way, in an anthropological way, mostly in a geographical way, in a political way. Where are we? What does it mean? And how can we create a meaningful and relevant project which has also long-term impact? And in this context, in Palermo, we invited OMA, and in Marseille, MVRDV, despite by accident, 2 international officer studios which are based in the Netherlands. But this gave a very clear indication that you need data, you need information, you need to do research. We call this pre-biennial research, which functions as the complete, let's say, mapping or breeding space for all the other projects which will originate from this. So both the urban visions are presented to the city as possible guidelines for how to develop the city, and sometimes other projects derive from it. But also it is the urban vision and the mapping of the cities are very much the basic of what artists, creative mediators, and all participants will produce afterwards. And I think this is, I haven't seen any biennial doing this until now. I think it is also coming directly from the fact that we are nomadic, as I said before, but it has a kind of an effect because many more cities are interested in this kind of incubation role of Manifesta. Because of course, most of the cities in Europe are working with urbanists, but there are specific problems to be addressed and in an interdisciplinary way. So it's not only urbanism, but urbanism together with data research together with sociology, sociologies together with reinventing culture policy. So this kind of more what we call holistic approach is something which cities are very much interested in. We got some criticism recently that Manifesta lost its autonomy. I think this is a kind of a little bit old-fashioned idea, because if you really want to change things, you cannot isolate yourself as a contemporary art event in a contemporary art event bubble. If you really want to make some kind of changes in a more holistic way, involving all kind of knowledge, disciplines, you need to involve administrations, and you need to negotiate and be flexible with administrations without losing, of course, your critical power or your autonomy. On the other side, Manifesta is also depending for its budget for, I would say, 70% on what cities and national governments are supplying us with. 30% comes from international budget. Manifesta is creating itself. So of course, there is a kind of a dependency on both sides, but with the 25 years of experience, maybe I would say only in Cyprus this went wrong, and then we also stopped the whole operations. But furthermore, we were always be able to maintain our independency, and we call it engaged autonomy. It is like a form of reciprocity. Okay. If you really want to have an impact, you need to work together, and this is in the world at large, but especially, of course, if you work on urban issues which will have a long-term effect. What we're now doing in Pristina, maybe this is interesting, we do symbolic intervention. This is voting with your feet. It's like saying to people, yeah, it's like, what we want to change, let's say, mobility in the city. And what Carlo Ratti, with whom we're working in Pristina, proposed is let's do some symbolic interventions in taking cars out of certain key parts of the city and see the immediately effect and impact. And this has been so successful that the Ministry of Culture is now emptying its own courtyard as a parking lot, changing it into a green space. And of course, this doesn't change immediately the entire mobility problem of the city of Pristina, but it has this kind of symbolic interventions effect that people see immediately the change. Immediately, people are starting to talk about it. And this is why we want to collaborate with administrations and public partners to make sure that it's followed up and has a long-term effect.
Okay, so Manifesta is now more like a transition agency, one could say, for cities with a very unique story. Now there are hundreds of new biennials spreading around the world. I mean, also, how do you see these chances for these small and specialized biennials to get attention in the art world? What could be their function? And do these biennials, like the biennial of Laban, for which we are now making this interview, have a future? And how should they act if they could be an important part of the future of their city where they're working in, or for the artistic world?
It's difficult for me to answer because I'm not so much involved anymore in this kind of international biennial organizations, but I could imagine that, yeah, the word biennial.
What would you be, if you have to consult someone who wants to make a biennial, what would you tell him?
I would rather, I would think that maybe biennials at large need to find a different wording for what they are doing, because the wording biennial has been a little bit toxicated because of the cultural marketing, because of the consumerism, because of the commercial aspects of biennials at large, because of gentrification processes. I could imagine that we rethink what biennials at large are doing. Of course, every biennial has a different scope, a different function, a different experimental methodology. What still stays there, especially in non-Western countries, is that biennials hopefully can influence cultural policy making. It can give a position to artists to produce new works. Don't underestimate that this has been in several areas of the world extremely important. Also in the beginning of Manifesta, we were producing for 1 or 2 million euro new works for artists who could normally not use this money. So I could imagine this is also important in other parts of the world. I could also imagine that creating a kind of interdisciplinary agenda in certain parts of the world could be a topic for biennials, and to be mediating between administrations, museums, the entire cultural ecosystem in certain parts of the world could be extremely important, to show international practices, to show different practices from different media. You can think about literature, poetry. It doesn't need to be visual arts, because biennials until now are associated with visual arts. So I think there's a lot to do. And I think it should be interesting what sort of open discussion there can be, especially under the, let's say, immediate effect of the COVID-19. And what I said before in terms of what Manifesta has done itself is also rethink our own practices in terms of how can we reduce traveling, how can we become more radical local and not so much focus on, let's say, bringing in 50,000 visitors from all over the world, flying them in. This is why we focus also on architecture and urbanism, to become more influential in a local context. Of course, still cities want also kind of exchange and dialogue with an international professional field. How can we create long-term meta-level projects? For example, we are initiating in Pristina tandems between former Manifesta host city museums and institutions together with Pristina, and then bring Pristina to future host cities. So I think everybody is looking for more sustainable networks. These networks can be light. and maybe less institutional than we all. We don't want to be entangled in bureaucratic procedures, and the smaller groups can operate, the better it functions. So in this sense, I could imagine that there is lots to do. I also think we should try to rethink the whole commercial consumer part of, let's say, what biennials used to be, and also art fairs. We know that artists need to have a financial economical backup in creating new works, but how can we maybe readjust this, work together, and try to find out how this could have, let's say, a more sustainable impact. So we are thinking a lot about, let's say, reducing our own mobility. What does it mean in terms of hybrid working, staying in the cities for a longer period, the nomadic principle in itself? Should Manifesta come home to a city? So it's a constantly critically reflecting upon our own. We have made like a green policy plan, in which people in the team bring in their own ideas about how we could like diminish our footprint. We're not traveling that extensively anymore. And we're also thinking about, for example, it seems to be small, reusing waste management, reusing all the materials for the exhibitions, using already existing materials for everything we're doing. So it's a constant struggle also to reevaluate your own principles and methodologies.
I mean, when I'm listening to you, I see that you see art also as a change maker in society, as one of the pillars on which we could stand in a transformational moment of society, which we are right now. And in this context, do you see art has to be moral? As a final question to you.
Well, I'm not seeing our practices purely as contemporary art. So I see it more as contemporary culture, in which I also include architecture, urbanism, or any other kind of medium. And yeah, what we are now researching ourselves and how morality is part of it, that has to be seen, because that's not up to me to judge. But I could imagine that in this whole way of involving citizens, we did this in Marseille, that also the cultural world can learn a lot about what moves people and what sort of voices do people have, and how can we involve the voices of different communities, and how can communities be involved in, I don't know, changing the way we look at culture, changing the way the relevance of culture is being presented to us, having an influence on deciding how their neighborhood, how their working place, how the community place, how the greening of the city also only comes to life if you empower people. And this is what we're trying to do on a very small scale. I'm also always saying we're not the United Nations. Now we're working together with the United Nations in Pristina, but we're trying to reevaluate our practices in a more participatory way. We did this in Marseille, we're doing this now in Pristina, and also thinking about, okay, but what does that mean for the functionality of an institution? Okay. So if there is a cultural institution, like we are invited in Pristina to set up a permanent cultural interdisciplinary institution, how can you involve the neighborhood, the communities around it? What sort of methodology can be set up? And this we hope to present in Pristina in 2022.
Well, then we are all looking forward to Pristina in 2022, and it sounds really very interesting what you're doing there. We will come with the train maybe, and not fly in, and we look at also our footprint coming to Manifesta will be reduced. We wish you all the best, and thank you very much for this interview. Thank you, Hedwig Fijen.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Yeah. Bye bye.